Alrighty, so tonight's screening, Deconstructing Portraiture, Embodied Landscapes, it came from an emotional place for me rather than like an intellectual or clinical or like a nerdy cinephile place. It came from thinking about the space that my own body as a Black woman, as a woman of color, the space that I take up, how I feel both small and gigantic at the same time. And so at the same time, I viewed Michelle Dizon's film Ex Utero and connected with her description about bodies as landscapes, which in her words are subject to the politics of scarring, division, and removal. And to me, that's similar to the sort of like post-colonial theory idea that women's bodies are sites of contestation. And so thinking through this film program further, I was struck by how portraiture or subversions of it, deconstructions of it, reclamations of it could, as Colleen Smith has said, be speculative. I was struck by how fully the subjects of these pieces loom in their respective frames, the power they exuded, no matter the context, whether it be trauma, survival, or mourning. So these films are in conversation with that idea, they're personal, but there's also an aesthetic and a formal conversation that I see at play. And so after the screening, I'll be in conversation with Michelle, the director of Ex Utero. So yeah, very excited about the screening. Enjoy, and please have some questions ready later. Thank you. Do a round of applause for all the filmmakers for this first. And there's also going to be a mic going around, but I'll start off with a couple of questions, and as soon as, if anyone has a question, just feel free to raise your hand and we'll run it up. So again, Michelle, thank you for that work. I mean, it's deeply personal, and there's obviously a vulnerability that you had to show, that your aunt and your mom had to show. Can you talk about just how they felt being in that and what it was like bringing the idea to them initially?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I just want to thank you, Jheanelle, for this program this evening. It's a very rare moment to see all of these women of color on the screen and their bodies and their feelings, and I don't remember a time when I've seen a screening like this, and that has touched me so deeply, so thank you for that. So my mom had to convince my aunt to participate in the video, and you know, neither of them particularly wanted to do it, but they did it for me. And you know, my mom has a much more kind of open sense about it, and like understanding that this is something that she went through, and it's okay for it to be in pictures. But my aunt did have preconditions, one of them being that no one that she knew could see it. And so I did invite her to this screening. By the way, she lives in West Covina. And she's like, no. And you know, for me, all of this kind of turns the whole idea of what it means to do ethical work on its head, because you know, there's this whole idea in documentary of, you know, have your subjects seen the work? Are they okay with it? Again, my subjects, you know, my mom has seen it, my aunt hasn't seen it, she doesn't want to see it, and all of that is okay. I understand, because I think what this work taught me is a lot about love. My aunt and my mom participated in the project because they loved me. That's the bottom line. That's the only reason. And I did the project because I think I needed to process what I have been going through with them in relation to the cancer. And you know, I mean, technically, in order to begin to approach an experience that was so close, I actually needed to get outside of the medium that I'm comfortable with, which is video. And so the whole, you know, 4x5 proof sheet thing was me entering into a whole different apparatus in order to be able to approach, you know, this experience that was so close that I needed to do something totally outside of what I was comfortable with in order to begin. So that's, I guess, some of the steps that the work took.
Okay. And to that point, stepping outside of what you said you've been comfortable with and doing, I guess, more photography in addition to the video, there's like interesting ways in which, as I see it, you're like subverting and muddying a gaze, whoever's watching it, not like the gaze, but just whoever's watching it in a very like literal sense. And I was wondering how you thought about your bodies, your own body, your aunt and your mother's bodies, sort of in the wake of what you had gone through in general, but also in the context of just like how you framed yourself and how you thought about the framing. I think the photographs in which I believe is it your mom that's facing? Yeah, that we just see her back and then she's holding the mirror and then we only see her breast through the mirror. Like that's such a layered image to me, and I was just wondering, so how you thought of framing and how you thought of your bodies in the frame?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are these multiple distanciations that take place throughout the video that actually, again, allowed for the intimacy to open. You know, I mean, for me, like, and I was trying to think about how to approach some of these questions on my way here, and I understood that I couldn't really talk about this film without talking about myself and talking about what I was going through in my body also. And you know, for the past 20 years, I've had polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it was only diagnosed, you know, 20 years after the fact of experiencing all of these very excruciating symptoms when I was desiring to get pregnant. And so going through the cancer with my mom, my aunt, in addition, alongside, you know, this long journey of polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is very much related to breast cancer in the sense of hormones and women's bodies and the way that they're moved through the Western medical system. You know, the kind of I think resonance across our bodies was very present for me. So, you know, I think that one of the first images in the work is me holding up the image of my mother's mammogram, which had been taken long before she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I think what I was going through in my body, as it resonated with what my mom and my aunt were going through in their bodies, or had gone through in their bodies, opened up for me all kinds of different passages within time that are not simply linear. And for me, video has always been a way of working in and through that kind of layered time, which I think then again gets layered with the different, I called it distanciation earlier, but just different levels of imaging that are almost infinite, I think, in the piece.
And also kind of to dovetail off that, can you talk a little bit more then about the relationship between, they're the portraits that you take for the film, they're old family portraits or archived and sourced portraits, and then there's also mammograms, and there's, like you said, all these different types of imaging. What are the relationships between them?
I think I was thinking a lot about light, and it's important to mention that the sound that you hear in the piece is the sound of a radiation machine. And my mom got treated right here at Kaiser Sunset. She lives in the Philippines, but she had come here to Los Angeles for treatment at the time. And it was probably a year or so after the fact of that treatment that I started this project. And it was difficult to get a sound recording of that machine. Of course, when I first introduced it to the staff at Kaiser Sunset, they were like, no, liability. But then I spoke specifically to the one person who had been treating my mother, who had remembered her, and he snuck it in. He snuck the sound recorder in to someone else's radiation therapy. And of course, radiation is light, as the Japanese cinema scholar Carol Lippett writes in a book called Atomic Light. It's a light that kills, and that is aligned with the advent of photography, of X-ray, of the early cinema, of all forms of image making, which we can also think about alongside the violence of colonialism and all of the forms of knowledge production, visual knowledge production that were part and parcel of that enterprise. So for me, photography as the writing of light alongside, radiation therapy of light that kills at the same time, but it's supposed to save you, alongside this other form of, image making, mammography, which is sound. Ultrasound. I was actually thinking of ultrasound, which is all of these ways of taking pictures of the body that resonate with these much larger histories of history and politics. That was, I guess, one of the main threads in the piece, alongside, I think, a word that has come up for me recently as being very prominent when I think about this work, which is exposure. And certainly thinking about the technology of, working in the darkroom and exposing, old technology of exposing light onto paper. But all of the other ways in which bodies in our experience are exposed, and in particular, I think as the voice in the piece leads us into what it is that both my mom and my aunt have gone through in their lives in terms of having to fend for themselves, in terms of having to support families, do all kinds of labor in order to keep it all going against all odds. For me, that's also, of form of exposure.
Any questions from the audience?
Hi. First of all, thank you for the whole evening, and to Michelle for your work here. But I'm hesitant to ask what may be a really blunt but also dumb question, which is in the framing of the three-member family portrait. I was left perplexed by your use of hair, your own hair, in terms of the way it, first of all, throughout I thought, oh, has Michelle also gone through breast cancer? So, and you expose one breast and use your hair to conceal the other. And is this deliberate to leave open the possibility that one breast may already be gone or had surgery on it? Or is this distanciation, or is this leaving it enigmatic? Or, and I don't know if anyone else had the same question, but for me it was very, I kept thinking through it, oh, it's through two generations, but both directly down and also through horizontally, and to sister, to daughter. So for me it was a little perplexing, sort of what you intended with using your hair in this way, when both your aunt and your mother in some ways were more directly exposing themselves for those radical changes in their body, for their mastectomies or lumpectomies. But thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how conscious it was at the time of making the portrait, but certainly now in looking at the piece, I think it's double. Like, I think on the one hand, it's my own fear of exposure, my lack of courage, you know, when I think about it in relation to that which my mom and my aunt show, I'm still hiding. But on the other hand, I also can see it in terms of this layered temporality that I talked about earlier, this future that has already come, you know, the hormonal imbalances that I was experiencing in my body, in which they, you know, that they had gone through in order to have had the breast cancer. And so there is almost this kind of premonition, perhaps, but I can't say that was intentional. You know, I don't remember it as being intentional. So I can also say I think I was a coward.
We all are.
Yeah, and it's okay for me to say that. Like, you know, I haven't seen this piece for a long time, and it did bring up a lot of emotions for me right now watching it. I think because of that distance from the time in which I was making it, because of being able to see myself a little bit more clearly now, to be able to make that admission to all of you. Yeah.
Hi, Michelle. Hello. I'm not sure I have a question, but I really wanted to say that I was really struck by incredible sense of clarity in your work, and I think just starting out with the light box and laying down the negatives that started in terms of a sense of time, laying out the story, and then the sound and the clarity of the sound. And I didn't experience radiation, but it's somewhat similar to the mammograms that I've had, and it's just very, and I love the way, just abstractly, just the way that you use sound throughout the film, and the kind of rhythmic sense that you establish throughout the film, and also how you use the light box not only to reveal the X-rays, but also to lay out some of the negatives that then you just flipped on to the positive images. And I thought that was really just incredibly effective. So I was just really reveling all the different ways that you exposed the different ways in which we could look at these images, but throughout there was just a real clarity to the whole project that I really appreciated. Thank you.
So one of the most I think definitely one of the most deeply touching experiences I've had this year with a piece of art, a piece of work was with Michelle's piece, The Archives Fold, which was included with the LA Municipal Art Gallery's COLA Fellowship exhibition this year. I saw it several times, I cried, it was a lot for me. And so this is kind of the genesis of how I got to Ex Utero and how I got to these other works that were in the program. So I'm gonna ask Michelle a question sort of in relation to the Archives Fold, and I'm gonna have to read it because it has some quotes in it. So part of Ex Utero's synopsis reads, quote, "Bodies hold memory. Bodies, like landscapes, are subject to the politics of division, scarring removal." It reminded me, end quote, it reminded me of a portion of the Archives Fold, and that reads, "It was a naive scientist who thought that images alone were identical to memory. A naive scientist who didn't understand that the least important thing about an image is what it shows." These are two distinct projects, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the thematic connections between them, and if there's a relationship between these projects or any similar concerns. Can you just talk about that and how it relates to your current artistic, political, social concerns and your practice as a whole?
So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Archives Fold is a project that I just completed this year, but it comes out of some in-depth archival research since 2015, and I think, its genesis was probably 20 years ago, when I first encountered some photography from the U.S. colonial moment in the Philippines. And the larger conceit of the project is that the year is 2131, something like that. And my great-great-granddaughter is a refugee in space because the Earth is uninhabitable, and she's en route to the planet Proxima B, where supposedly life can be, human life might be possible, but she's in correspondence with my great-great great-grandmother in 1905. And the images that are in the piece are all on slide projector. In one room, there's a 10-image slide projection of mainly images that I had culled from the archives in Washington, D.C. In particular, there's a large collection in the National Archives from the Bureau of Insular Affairs, which was the governing body in the United States for the Philippines from 1900 to 1939. And then the next room intersperses images of Proxima B. These are kind of artist visualizations of what this place might look like, with mostly images of women from my own family archive. So I do think that one of the main resonances between this Archives Forward project and the one that you saw today, Ex Utero, has a lot to do with photography, and in particular the legacy of colonial photography, U.S. colonial photography in the Philippines. And this one volume that I had run across when I was still an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, that was called Our New Possessions in the Philippine Islands by a photographer named J.D. Gibbons, who had accompanied the U.S. military to the Philippines in the early 20th century. And in 1914, this volume was produced for mass circulation about the Philippines. And in particular, I think there are two images from that volume that have, I think, really been something that I've thought about for a long time, and have been that kind of something I've been considering in my work since that time of my first encounter, which is, throughout that volume are a lot of the kind of stereotypical ways of categorizing the people and the culture of the Philippines, alongside texts that ideologically drives the meaning of those images and produces all kinds of typologies. But within that volume were very specific ways in which gendered violence was taking place. On the one hand, the Filipino woman being the site of sexual availability, and on the other hand, the Filipino man as being that which needed to be killed. And these were very literal representations within that volume. And I think that kind of the gendered violence of imperialism and the ways in which that becomes visualized, has been a long-running thread of interrogation in my work, and it's certainly one that I, see something like Ex Utero and the poses and the ways in which, as I was saying earlier, this kind of ethos of love that runs across it. I feel like that's in my mind in a direct counterpoint to a lot of this history of visual violence and occupation that has been so much of, not only that specific, volume that I'm talking about, but that volume has a long-standing legacy that continues into the present, and that is not something that, that has ended with quote-unquote multiculturalism, or, another project that I did recently is called White Gaze, which is actually dealing with the whole archive of National Geographics, and serendipitously the artist book that I did alongside Viet Le, White Gaze, came out with National Geographic's issue about the racism that has existed within the publication in the past. And yet, that admission of National Geographic's racism is in a way a kind of consolidation of legitimacy for the future. That's the only way that they can continue into the future, is by admitting that. But that admission is in a way saying, okay, it's over, it's done, we're good. But for me, that legacy of imperialism within visuality continues into journalism, contemporary journalism, in human rights discourse. So none of it is over. And we don't do this work because it's over. We do this historical work because all of this continues.
Yeah, I think we can do one more. Yeah.
Thank you again for this event and for showing very moving and vulnerable film. I just had a question. What made you come up with the title Ex Utero? What was your inspiration behind that?
Certainly thinking across generations and thinking about, I had mentioned earlier the polycystic ovarian syndrome that I was experiencing and the desire of my own body, of my own self, to be pregnant, and then possibility of that because of the condition that I was experiencing. And that alongside understanding that while my mom had given birth to me, she had also just recently gone through breast cancer, which again is our hormones are driving so much of ourselves. So in a way, like to say ex utero is also to say in utero. It's to talk about the continuity and the resonances that exist across generations, the ways in which women's bodies, especially within that mother-daughter circuit, are always connected. And I think that the kind of folding in always when you're thinking about outside or inside, this way that the two are actually codependent on each other, inextricable from each other, and that relationality is actually a different way into understanding portraiture. Because, certainly within the legacy of the West, portraiture has been all about consolidating power, all about, the representation of an individual and their wealth. But what about when portraiture can be about relationships, about the indistinguishability between me and you, about a different ethos of living outside of accumulation, about love. So that's ex utero.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you again, Michelle.